Hi everyone, it's lovely to see so many of you today on a very early Tuesday morning. Welcome to our first panel at the 2022 NSUN members event, which is about telling the story of survivor history and activism. So my name's Akiko, I use she, her pronouns, and I work as the chief exec of NSUN. So mental health survivor activism has a long and rich history full of both personal and collective stories. But the independent and grassroots nature of a lot of survivor and lived experience-led organising means that it is not always archived or documented in the history books. We also have to reckon with injustice around knowing and knowledge, including silencing, misrepresentation, and the undervaluing of lived experience knowledge. Thinking about what it means to archive survivor history brings up a lot of questions. Whose and which stories get told, who tells them and how? Why is it important to keep survivor history alive on our own terms? And what does it mean to have survivor histories recorded, discussed, responded to, and disseminated? So joining us today are Mark Brown and Naomi Salisbury. So please, by the way, pop any questions you have during the discussion into the chat, and I will pick them up either at the end or during the conversation. So to kick us off, Naomi, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to this panel today? What excites you about these questions?
Absolutely. Hi there, my name is Naomi Salisbury. I'm the chief exec of an organisation called Self-Injury Support, which is an experience-led organisation based in Bristol, but works nationally supporting people affected by self-harm. So we have, in the last couple of years, done an oral history project of our organisation. Our organisation was set up as a women's collective in the 1980s. And it was a group of women. I think the story starts, 3 lesbians were trapped in a psychiatric hospital and decided that they wanted something different and better. And it was a group of women who got together and said, we're not getting the support we need. It's very punitive. There's not curiosity or understanding of the experiences that might have led us to self-harm. And so they set up a local helpline, I think in a cupboard in the back of a charity shop. And very quickly it became a national helpline, and the organisation has gone from there. And I think for me, it was really important to capture the voices of the women who'd set that up and had kind of gone before us, just to see what's changed, what hasn't changed. And it's really easy now that we're like an established regulated organisation to forget the origins and how that came about. And especially now the sector is very much, there's a lot about tendering and commissioning and almost fighting for your place. To me, it felt really incredibly important to go back to why were we set up? What was that about? And what of those values are we still carrying in the organisation today, and how do we carry on embodying them? So I guess I'm just really interested to discuss how we collect stories, whose stories get told. I was with another organisation in Edinburgh which also did an activism history project, which I think really sparked my interest in this. So I'm just really keen to have that conversation about this area, because I find it really fascinating. I feel really humbled of what's gone before me, and people who've paved the way for the kind of the work that I and other people are doing now. And I think it's also really motivating and inspiring for future work as well.
Awesome, thank you so much. So Mark, the same question to you. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what's brought you here today?
Hello everyone, my name is Mark Brown. For once, I've managed to unmute myself before I started speaking. You'd think I would have got used to that after 7,000 years of the pandemic, but I haven't. The question what brings me here is kind of weird. So my kind of big involvement in doing stuff around mental health and stories began in about 2006, where I had the absolutely ridiculous idea of starting a magazine written by people with mental health difficulties, for people with mental health difficulties, called 1 in 4, that we did up until 2014. And then after that, when we finished that, because lots of people liked it, but no one wanted to give us any money for it, I did a project called Day in the Life that was about asking people across the country on 4 calendar days to record just what their day was like living with mental health difficulty and trauma and distress. So I've always been really, really fascinated by kind of how the stories around mental illness, distress, trauma, and the people who experience it kind of come into kind of public usage, and how those stories shape the way that subsequent people who experience similar things understand their own experiences. It's fascinating in the idea of archiving, fascinating with the idea of the generation of knowledge, but also kind of the generation of narrative as well, and who gets to set that narrative and where those narratives come from, and the way that available media, means of organisation, etc., also shape the narratives of what things mean. Aside from that, I'm Mark114 on Twitter for however long that'll last. might not make it to the end of this meeting, who knows. So yeah, that's me. I'm going to go back on mute now.
No, don't, because I'm about to ask you something. So you talked a little bit.
Oh no!
I know. You talked a little bit about that context, and you've both spoken about this in different ways, about, like, you know, different media. Can you kind of say a little bit more about that? So you've spoken about the work that you did, which was online, right? And yeah, so do you think that is the main place where these stories are getting archived, if any?
Yes and no. I think it's a really interesting thing. So up to a certain point, the things you could know around mental health and mental ill health and distress and trauma and what it means to you and to other people were limited by either what you could see on the telly, what you could read in newspapers, what other printed materials you had access to, but also the people that you happened to run into. So up to a certain point, I think a lot of the survivor narrative is kind of defined by who people met and at what point in their lives and their experiences. And then the web comes along, not when it originally arrived in the mid-90s, but in the kind of early 2000s, 2003, 2004, 2005. And then social media kind of falls in behind that. And what that is for me is, it's like there was a committee meeting that lasted for 20, 30 years with a small number of prominent people having the opportunity to talk and share and shape the narrative. And then suddenly everyone turns up and it's a big conversation, it's a big talk. And I think that really, really changes the idea of survivor history and survivor experience, because very suddenly what you weren't just seeing was the things that people had chosen to record and chosen to archive. What you were really seeing, what we're all seeing, was each other in real time, living through personal events, local events, national events, international events. I think that makes a kind of really big difference to how we all began to talk about our own experiences, because suddenly the room wasn't empty and it wasn't just us and some people who had been notable enough to be recorded in some form. It was loads and loads of people, and that created a very, very interesting kind of new place that we're at, because, you know, it's very hard now to say that you have kind of complete ignorance of other people's experiences, and that has, you know, massive advantages, but also sometimes massive drawbacks as well. But I do think, yeah, I think online discourse and the accessibility of online tools for sharing experience in real time has really changed stuff, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
What's your sense of that, Naomi?
Myself. Yeah, I think what Mark says, the internet has made an enormous difference. It's a massive leveler in a lot of ways. I think for me also, and certainly in my experience, there's been something about almost passing the baton to a new generation. And that when I first came and was involved in kind of oral history and tracking survivor history work, especially in Scotland, I think there was a sense that a lot of people who had been involved in a lot of early activism, especially in the 60s and 70s, felt that the age they were getting to, they couldn't be as actively involved anymore. They had other priorities in their lives, but they also didn't. But there was also a changing mood. I think in Scotland there was some quite significant legislation which led to a statutory requirement for community and hospital-based advocacy on an individual and collective level, and I think there was almost a bit of a sense of, the battle's been won, it's there. But then when you actually got on, and I was working in one of these agencies that was a sort of statutory requirement, but there was such variation in how that was interpreted by the NHS and local authorities who were funding those. And then you also get into that discussion of how independent is this advocacy if it's being funded by statutory bodies. And so I think there was a sense of not wanting to lose what had gone before, but also keeping that questioning stance of actually, this is what we've done in the past. Are we being as radical and disruptive? Are we just going with the status quo because it is funding us, because that's where the funding is coming from? And is that really what people need on the ground? And I think there's something about that, about almost, I feel like there's something about being almost like a next generation and trying to carry on, and that there's a weight to that of responsibility of not losing what's gone before you, because there's, I think, especially in my field around self-harm, there was a lot of amazing sort of really radical activism in the 80s and 90s, and it does feel a bit like that has kind of disappeared and we've gone a bit backwards. And people are referring to things that a National Self-Harm Network did as sort of historical rather than actually current and live documents, which I think they still are. And I think there's that aspect too, that we talk about archives and we talk about history, but a lot of what is learned and brought from survivor histories is actually really live and still really relevant to today. Certainly doing the history project in our organisation, what we were talking about what people need, about the space to witness and recognise trauma and distress without medicalising it, I think that space is needed more than ever. So I think it's quite important actually not to think about it all as an archive, so much as living documents that kind of still massively inform what we want to do now.
Oh,
sorry.
There was a Zoom pause there.
Okay.
So that's super interesting, because there's something there about archiving or documenting having a political purpose, and it not being about something that happens in the past, but about something that informs the present and the future. Does that chime with your sense of it, Mark, or could there be multiple purposes to doing this?
Kind of depends on what you assume an archive is and what it means and who it belongs to. You know, I kind of really like mental health projects, survivor projects, where they just refer to our history rather than any other kind of history. Because, you know, if you look at the history of mental ill health, distress and trauma, what we have is a history of the castles and the kings and queens, but not very much about the people who worked in the kitchens or cleaned out the toilets. Like, there's not much. There is, I shouldn't say there's not much. There are examples going back of people's narratives of lived experience, but it's not where the centre of gravity lies. I think there's really big challenges around archiving, I think, because I think it's extremely difficult unless you are the kind of academic who is sitting very comfortably in their academic citadel, not to find archiving in some way problematic or challenging, because in some ways you will always be, unless people self-submit the things that they desire to go in an archive, you are always in some respects being extractive. You are taking and assembling other people's experience, other people's documents, other people's words, other people's videos, and then putting them together into a form that you think's best. And I think that that's really challenging, because creating a history, creating an archive, creating a stack of things is a job of work. And one of the challenges, I think, for people who experience marginalisation in any way is that it's really piggy and tiring living at the margins of a livable life. So quite rightly, you might feel that that very much makes it a bit of a challenge in terms of emotional labour or practical labour to actually establish a history, to keep a track of stuff. But then when someone else turns up, like a white knight on a horse, sorry about all these medieval kind of metaphors, I don't know where all that's coming from. Yeah. When someone else turns up to make your archive of your experiences for you, to write about what's happened, to document what's happened, to be a journalist, to be an archivist, to be a historian, to be an oral historian, it's not a morally or politically neutral action. So on one hand, I think it's very, very important. The internet alone will not be an archive of the last 20 years, because the internet is like decaying, like some bread at the back of the cupboard. There's just bits are disappearing from that particular fossil record. Very important. Stuff that I've loved, stuff that has been incredibly important to me is, blogs, tweets, videos. They've been ephemeral. They've evaporated like water after a rainstorm in the sun. So I think it's not an uncomplicated thing. I'd love to hear, Naomi, kind of your experiences of having been involved in that kind of archiving, and whether it was as purely simple and good an experience as it sounds from the outside, or whether it was more complicated and something that really had to be negotiated and thought about a lot during the time of doing it. I think it's difficult because sometimes the most amazing things that you come across are shared by people in certain contexts at certain times for certain reasons, and quite rightly they don't want it to be captured for posterity forever, and they don't want it to be strip mined or fracked out of the ground and then used to fuel something else. So I think it's massively challenging in lots of respects. But no more medieval metaphors from me, okay?
I'm just going to read a comment from the chat, Naomi, which is about how there are archives in the People's Museum in Manchester. I mean, are you okay to speak a little bit more about some of that process that kind of Mark just referred to, around the Oral History Project, and some of the ethical challenges you might have faced, which I think Mark kind of just flagged just now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, just as a disclaimer, I wasn't, we had a community history worker who was doing this work directly, and all credit to her because she did all of these processes and she thought about all this stuff, but unfortunately because the project's finished, she's no longer with our organisation. But yeah, I think the sort of ethics and the sort of asking people to go back to stuff that might be really painful and difficult was really at the forefront of our mind when we were doing this, and we were really thinking carefully about what do we want to ask people. And also because the interviews on the project were mainly done by volunteers. And so it was thinking about what were we asking them to do as well, what were we asking them to delve into, and I guess maybe not, I don't know if expose is the right word, but asking them to hear and witness that perhaps they wouldn't have anticipated in an oral history project. So those were really big. And also I think, as I kind of alluded to before, quite a lot of people we wanted to talk to were actually fairly elderly, some living in supported accommodation and things like that. And it's thinking, well, you know, this might seem really relevant and interesting to us, but that may not be a part of their lives they want to go back to. And I think we tried to give people as many options as possible. You know, a really key person, she absolutely did not want to be recorded, which was gutting for us running the project, but we had to respect that. You know, because that was not the purpose of the project, to force people to be put on record. So we just tried to work around that. So there were some informal interviews with her, and she connected us up with a lot of other people who were happy to be recorded. There's a number of people who've been recorded who their interviews sealed for about 30 years. So that was an option as well. And in terms of actually how we use the data, so of the interviews we did, they have all gone into an archive at Bishopsgate archive. And so the full interviews have gone in, so we didn't pick and choose, we didn't chop bits out of those. So that is just everything. But equally, again, that is the people that we could get in touch with, the people that wanted to talk to us, and the people that I guess we found from paperwork that seemed like important and relevant. Where we have maybe done that cherry picking is that we had some podcasts made about the project. And I, in all honesty, that I was actually quite unwell for the last part of the project, so I wasn't able to be involved. And I came back and listened to these podcasts, and they're really powerful. But there is obviously an element of picking those quotes to make them powerful, if that makes sense. So I know what Mark's saying is that there's that curation to get the point across that you want to get across. I think it's really, really tricky, because once you put your story out there, be it written down in a blog, in a book, in a history interview, you can't really control what other people do with it. So I think it's also worth considering that we're asking something really quite big of people, something quite significant, to take a bit of your life that meant something to you in a certain way and put it into the public domain and let other people interpret it in potentially a different way, which I think is quite a significant thing to ask. And I think for me, I know there's a lot of people doing really great work in sort of mainstream academic research, but there are, I feel still a lot of research where there's not a lot of thought about what they're actually asking people to do. And so they're saying, come and do this interview about a really significantly traumatic experience in your life, and if you're upset afterwards, phone the Samaritans. And I'm like, have the Samaritans signed up to this to be the support network for every single piece of mental health research in the entirety of the UK? And I think we wanted to just be more, and I have definitely worked with researchers who are a lot more careful and thoughtful than that, but I think we definitely did not want to go down that route. And we did offer like debriefing for the interviewees and the volunteers. We've written up sort of like booklets and things which have been sent to everybody who's been involved. And there was obviously a fairly extensive consent forms. And like I said, everything's in Bishopsgate archive. So if people want to listen to those interviews, we don't actually have any of that stuff anymore. It's gone to that archive. We are not the owner of it. So we have had to delete it all. So all of that stuff is sitting in an archive where it can only be accessed under certain circumstances, but in a broader, it is quite a broadly accessible archive, and it's in central London. That was one of the reasons for picking it rather than something that's a bit more obscure and harder to get hold of. But yeah, I think it's a really tricky area, and I think it's always, and I know that one of the things the community history worker did was that she actually worked with the volunteers and people who were potentially going to be involved in the project on what questions to ask and how to do that process, so that it was very much led from within the project rather than one person thinking, oh, these are really good things to ask. It was done on quite a collective basis. And I think my starting point in this sector was in collective advocacy, so I'm always very keen on that, even though it can take significantly longer to get there. But I do think it's a really worthwhile approach to just be thinking about things as a group and in different groups and bouncing things off each other. I think that it can get you more interesting questions, and it can bring up some of these ethical issues that perhaps you wouldn't think of as an individual or as a small group.
Totally right, because you pick stuff up when you're having these conversations in the round in a very different way. I'm just picking up a couple of comments from this chat about the Survivor History Group and this Study More website. and how there are plans to archive some of that material in the Bishopsgate archive as well, which is really exciting. Okay, I'm going to rewind a little bit to one of the starting kind of like questions we had, and I think we've kind of covered it in different ways, but it'd be super interesting to kind of dig into it a little bit more. And you might even feel that it's not the right place to start, that this isn't the right question. I'm kind of interested in, whose stories get told and whose stories, we don't hear. And that's coming from lots of different perspectives, right? So for example, a number of years ago, there was a survivor history type exhibition at the Maudsley, the museum that belongs to the Maudsley in Southeast London. And some of the feedback from that was that it was very much focused on survivor researchers, so like a very specific group of people within the very wide group of people who live with mental ill health and distress and trauma. And within that group, that it was very white, that it was very much the story of certain white survivor researchers. So that's my starting point. But what about you? Which stories do you think kind of get the most exposure or focus? And which do you think we're just not talking about for whatever reason?
I can dive in on that one. I think, yeah, in some ways, the stories that get told is a problematic idea in itself, because we're all telling stories all the time. We're all sharing our experiences all the time. It's just a question of who we're sharing them with and for what purposes and reasons. It's not like, it's not like in the world, no one who experiences mental ill health, distress and trauma is talking to anyone else unless there's a researcher there to note it down in shorthand. People are talking all the time. I think, for me, historically, the stories got told, or the stories got recorded by the people who were closest to whatever the dominant mode was of making and recording stories. So initially it would have been initially it would have been clinicians who recorded people's histories for their very specific purposes for doing that, and some of them were nicer and some of them were horrible, and some of them thought, oh, we'll put on an exhibition or we'll publish a book or whatever. Then there's a kind of breakthrough in the 60s, a bit of kind of first person accounts, but they very much fit into the kind of redemption model or the anti-psychiatry model. So it's either, I was very ill and now I'm brilliant, or look at me, I'm this glorious, multifaceted, confusing thing, and isn't it a bit like the Rolling Stones taking acid? Ooh. And then as things go on, it's being adjacent to academia or being interesting enough to journalists to be covered. And then the internet comes along and it kind of changes a bit. So I think historically it's a story that has been focused on people's experience of hospitalisation and incarceration, much less focused on people's experience of marginalisation, of lost chances, lost opportunities and stuff like that. And I know that as soon as I say this, someone's going to say, yes, but there was this history and this person said this in 1987 and stuff like that. And unfortunately, I have not had a chance to read all of history. But I think the stories that get communicated is more of a question than the stories that get told. And it's not even the stories that get collected, because people, share lots of things across lots of different media. So sometimes, and in some political situations, I think it's the stories that are most political in one way or another, the most scandalous, the stories that most speak to a dominant obsession of the age. So if you go back to the 90s and deinstitutionalisation and community care, lots of stories about about, not necessarily by, but about people who are homeless, who also experience mental ill health, distress and trauma. You don't see so many stories like that at the moment because this narrative has moved on in lots of different ways around that story. I think, sometimes very boring stories don't get communicated very much, as in, I'm a very boring person. I like trains. I have a diagnosis that other people would consider to be very, very serious, and a set of experiences that others would find very disabling. But at the minute, I'm doing fine. I think, there isn't really, for me, a way of assessing the things that don't get told beyond the fact that it follows the path of wider marginalisations and exclusions. I tell you, the stories that do get told, and the ones that get communicated, are the ones that are told best, or the ones that make people cry most. So some people are very gifted at communicating their own experiences and have a very successful career in doing so, and other people have an experience that is so absolutely 100% recognisable as an injustice that gets communicated and shared. But I think, it follows broader contours of exclusion, marginalisation, and the amount that some people in society hate other people in society.
Before you come in, Naomi, I'm just going to read a couple of comments from the chat that respond to what Mark just said. So someone is saying, Mark, love that point. I often think journalism writes the stories of the gory bits with the sad endings, and academics, particularly in psychology or psychiatry, tell the stories of what they view as their own success. And then someone else has posted the stories that get told, the ones that would also be media friendly, a young, attractive person with a wonderful, supportive family, all willing to be shown, who are made better by services with no problems of waiting lists or misdiagnosis. Not told are the awkward ones where a person is estranged from their family, the person has verbal outbreaks and don't have a getting better soon narrative, which I think reflects some of what you've said. Someone else has put in the past, I've had my story and then self-help group story published in the press simply by sending out press releases. Naomi, what's your sense of all of this?
I think, I massively agree with what Mark's saying about that broader thing, sort of strand of when people are more a way that people are seen as marginalized or defined as marginalized within society, and that tends to marginalize them in any arena. And I think that, there has been a lot in the past 20 years of these sort of anti-stigma campaigns have very much been that put the face to mental illness. And I think, I when I was younger, I did do that with my now husband, and I almost regret it because they did want but I think I was more, I guess, naive and in a different place in my understanding and my journey in this field and my own experience. And that kind of nice wrap up story of now we're together and it's all fine, and which is basically complete rubbish, but it was true to us then. But I think there's very much that, and I know that every so often in my organization we get a journalist request and they're like, want to speak to a person this age, this has happened and now they're better. And I'm like, I'm not a repository. I don't keep people in a cupboard for this purpose. I used to struggle with this as well when we worked in advocacy. Oh, could you just bring a person to this policy meeting? I'm like, well, what's it about? What do you want them to do? What special, it's like as if you just have a bunch of people there to tell their story. And there is very much that redemption, that recovery. And I think coming from Scotland, where there's a really strong culture of storytelling, like in Edinburgh, there's actually like a national storytelling centre, and it is a profession. I think there is that very, so everybody's willing to go to the pub and wax lyrical about whatever, tell you on the bus their life story, that kind of thing. I think there's that element, there's a cultural element too. And I'm not saying that people in Scotland are more open to this type of story, because I actually think they're not. There's a massive emotional literacy, issue. But I think there is a sense of talking and winding tales around things that is very embedded in the culture, which means that there's more space for that. But again, it's about the acceptable stories. It's about the ones that wrap things up nicely or that are humorous, that kind of thing. And I think there is that sense of who's most marginalized. And I think there is, unfortunately, still we're very skewed towards it's white, middle class, reasonably well educated, able to communicate in a certain way, able to communicate in a way that people find, palatable and is acceptable for certain types of media. And I think, and I know that, to be honest, I think all of us, I'm here, I very much fit that stereotype, and I do get asked to do this kind of thing. And I think there is an element of all of us perhaps, saying, okay, if I've been asked twice in the could I do one and step someone else up into that space? But also people don't want to be sort of tokenistically shoved in. And so I think it's really tricky. I almost feel like, as that white middle class university educated person, I'm not sure I'm the person to speak to those experiences of marginalization, because although I've been marginalized in other ways, that I have not been marginalized around my class, my education, my ethnicity. I think Mark is right that there has been a lot of focus on people's experiences of hospitalization. And that is seen as like the big bad, the big terrible thing, when actually the vast majority of people who are struggling with their mental health are not going to be hospitalized. And that's actually quite a minority experience, although it's a very significant experience for anyone that happens to it. It is a minority experience. And that actually that community space, there's a lot of stuff going on, and people are very, I guess, pushed aside in community spaces and in mental health systems. And in the same way, they also organize in community spaces and do things that often fly completely under the radar. They wouldn't get noted as activism for anyone, but actually they really are significant spaces. And I think those often go missed. I used to run, when I lived in Edinburgh, I used to run a BPD sort of peer support group. And we used to just meet in a cafe, used to stick a sign on the table saying we're a book club so that people could locate us, but without having to and that was a really powerful experience. Made some really good friends. And I'm still friends with people that I invited to my wedding. And I remember one guy who came and he said, I was told not to meet other people with this diagnosis because they're all really sick and they'll just make me worse. And he still says to me, coming to that group was one of the best decisions of my life. We've both been to each other's weddings, supported each other through various difficult times. And to me, it feels like that group was a little radical space that we created. But I'm sure it's not recorded anywhere. But it was a space where I think for a lot of people for the first time, there was a space to go, you just are who you are, and you are being gaslit to an extent by the system, and you are being marginalized by the system. And actually to meet other people with those experiences was really, really powerful. But equally, I don't know if I'd have had the confidence to set that up had I not been involved with collective advocacy as a job. So it is, again, that about, I think there's something about facilitating and opening up spaces, but then letting people just go and do their own thing. But then do we need to document everything? Because it becomes a bit like, when you're asked to evaluate everything, like you're shopping at Tesco and buying something online, you're just like, oh, I'm not evaluating the courier who dumped something in my bin, thank you very much. You get to a point where it's like, yeah, how much do we, and that's my other question, how much do we need to get these things written down? And it's a really difficult balance. So I feel like I've rambled enough on that point.
How much do you think, Mark?
Well, I mean, this is the challenging thing, isn't it? Because ultimately, the question you're asking, the kind of ultimate overarching question is what is a history for? Like, what is the point of it? Because history is not just activism. The history of what it means to be a person who lives with mental ill health, distress and trauma does not just include, meetings that people had and organisations that people formed and connections that people made. It's also about a group of people travelling through time, living with circumstances, conditions, and attitudes, all of those things that they themselves didn't make. So I think it's a really interesting one, because the question is kind of, I suppose the first thing is that there's no one history, and that's a really important thing to talk about. There are some people who don't want to survive for generations in the memory of others. There are some circumstances, some occasions, some situations, some experiences that people would quite happily throw in the dustbin of history, for a whole variety of different reasons. It can, I think it can be a curse sometimes to always act as if you are acting for posterity, writing for your own future biographers or your own future historians. But at the same time, it comes back to the question of why are we looking to tell a story, and what are we looking to tell a story of, make history of? And I think, probably falling back on Rebecca Solnit here, that the idea that people without a history cannot have hope that change is possible, because without being able to see change over time, you can be very, very seduced by the idea that nothing ever changes. So in some ways, kind of history making and history sharing is a political tool for change, even if the story that you're telling is one of things getting worse, a story of frustration, a story of unhappiness. It's not just always the good things, the positive things. It's also the negatives and the voids and the things that weren't there. And I think that for me is probably the challenge with stories around, like with histories of survivorship, is that there's a kind of survivorship bias in that we get to tell, the stories and histories that are communicated to future generations are the ones of the people who survive, the people who get to the point of enough stability to be able to record those things. And that's kind of, it goes back to your question, Kiko, about, ultimately who isn't in this history. Not what is this history about, but who isn't in this history. And the reality is that, many millions of people, millions, billions of people potentially since the start of time have experienced, ill health, distress, trauma, whatever you might call it, and they aren't in that story. But then you fall into the trap of trying to make a history of everything forever, and capture everything. So kind of, I don't know. I suppose that my answer is a little bit. It's important to be aware of what the history you're collecting or sharing or creating is, and what it isn't. Yeah. So that's no medieval metaphors this time. So doing well.
Oh, is this coming to me, or is there a question? Yeah, I was thinking actually when you were saying that, Mark, that we now have, because we've got camera phones, there's this sense of like document everything. I have a 6-year-old and she's just constantly, take a photo of this, take a photo of this. We were watching a film yesterday and she was like, take a photo of the film. I was like, are you what? Why? So I think we've got this space where we feel like we need to document everything. And I know I'm probably not alone in having like thousands of photos on my phone and then not actually doing anything with them. So I think there is something really significant about what are we recording the history for. I guess in the same way that you sort of have to abide by data protection, in that you can't collect information from people for no good reason, that actually by collating historical archives or asking people about their experiences, what is the purpose? Is it just because it's interesting to you, or is it got some wider purpose? And I think it's a really difficult question, because it is different for everybody, what the purpose of that is. And I know, like for me, when I worked in Scotland, seeing people that I knew who'd been interviewed for a history project coming and doing current activism with me and my colleagues was a really powerful thing that made it feel like a really live thing and almost like I'm making history, which felt like it felt quite a significant thing to be doing. And I think there's something very powerful about that sense that even as one individual or as a collective, you can make an influence. And here are other people like me who have struggled with their mental health, who've potentially been in and out of hospital, who are not in the place that society might expect them to be at that point in their life, and they're still impacting on things. They're still making change happen through tenacity, or through the fact that they are not in some box, and it's almost easier to step out and go, I am going to do something disruptive and radical because I'm not, because it's almost easier for me because I'm already not seen in a certain way. And I think that's quite a powerful, quite freeing thing to witness. And I think that the sort of histories can give us that sense that that's possible. I know within our organisation there are a number of people that we were not able to interview because they have subsequently passed away, and I think there is a really strong sense of loss, and that we have missed out on something by not being able to talk to them. But equally, it almost makes their presence bigger, if that makes sense, because we've sort of what we do have about them has become very significant in the archive because we feel like there could have been more. So I think it's a difficult line to kind of to walk between doing something that's purposeful, because it's impossible to be purposeful all the time as a human. Sometimes you're just curious, sometimes you're just nosy, you just want, and I think that is sometimes the reason that you're just like, really, that's really interesting, tell me more about that. But I think, as with any story, you can put it out there and the response can be something you didn't expect. I think one example for me at the moment is that on our website we're running a blog series about underrepresented experiences of self-harm, and that was something that when we did a bit of evaluation last year, and people told us that they felt as an organisation we should be challenging this narrative of self-harm as about it's a coping strategy, it's a thing to release pent-up emotions, and that is it. And I think for us the purpose of those narratives is to try and to challenge that neat and well, I don't know if neat and tidy, but that kind of very standardized, almost manualized understanding of something that we know as an organization is so complex and so individual and different for the same person at different times, and just to try and open up that understanding. And that's certainly, and I think there's been that, but there's also been the response of so many people saying, I've had this experience and I've never heard anyone else talk about it. And I think that, to me, if someone is feeling more connected with others and less alone, I feel like that is a really significant thing that you can do as well. To read about an experience that chimes with yours is a really significant thing to happen. And I think that is a really good purpose for collecting these stories as well.
I'm just going to read a comment from the chat, Naomi, in response to that, which is what a brilliant project, and we'll put the link in the chat because it absolutely is. I am going to pick up a couple of comments from the chat, and please start popping your questions for Mark and Naomi into the chat as well. So Mark, in response to something you said earlier on, someone has said that's such an important point, that the stories which are communicated are from those who have survived long enough to tell that story. So it's really, really powerful point. Lots of people have picked up on the complexities around some of this and how there isn't one story. So someone has said, I agree that history is about more than activism. It's about our different lived experiences. Someone said, I often use her story. And someone has said, yeah, it's very hard to write an overarching coherent narrative about such a complex history, especially if you're part of that history because you know how complex it is. Someone has put something in which I wondered if you could respond to, around being a consumer of these stories? So we talked about communicating them, but what is it like to consume them? So someone has said, looking at myself as a consumer of stories and wondering, why do I like the redemption and feel good stories? It makes me feel good, the chemicals in my body. Wondering how I'm conditioned to like and value those kinds of stories. Complex stories are hard work, and our education doesn't prepare us for that. So yeah, I wondered if you can kind of like pick up on that side of things. And I'm thinking more broadly as well, because I think you've both mentioned, for example, Time to Change and the kind of like the big anti-stigma campaigns, and you've talked about which stories feel more palatable in the media. And I'm just wondering if the people those stories are communicated for are a different bunch of people to the people we might be talking about, if that makes sense. So are the stories that are going out in the media or, you know, in big anti-stigma campaigns, well, who are they meant for? And is that an archive, or is that something else entirely? Okay, big questions. Mark, you're leaning forwards.
Well, yeah. Well, everything has a history, doesn't it? So like, you know, the history of Time to Change, or and the campaigns in Wales, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, across the world that have been about anti-stigma, they all have a history, they all have an impact, they all have an effect. They have a history of their own, in fact. Might not be history that some people are very interested in, but they have a beginning, a middle, and in terms of Time to Change, a quite definitive end. The impact they have also has a kind of history and a story. The anti-stigma moment back in 2006 was kind of based on the idea that there were some people who experienced mental ill health, distress and trauma, and they had never spoken to anyone about it ever, and had just put it in a little tiny box inside their chest and locked it hard and never told anyone about it, which was incorrect. And then there was a much broader, wider population who'd never heard of these exciting things, these people, these experiences and stuff like that. That, of course, was never true. But the point of that moment was to poll public opinion. And it wasn't about making the opinions of people who lived with mental ill health or the opinions of people who lived with mental ill health, distress and trauma better. It was about making the attitudes of people who thought that those people should go in a shed and never talk to anyone or be launched into space, or any of the ridiculous ideas, or they should all just take, you know, eat kale and, you know, fart their way to health. Like that those people's attitudes were the ones that were being changed. I think in terms of like consumption of stories, the stories or histories or narratives that we most like are the ones that make most sense to us. So I think in some ways you might look at a kind of, it's not an iceberg, it's not a pyramid, it's more like a kind of network of ideas and thoughts. So you start from a basis of no knowledge and experience of a particular thing, and then you get a little bit of knowledge or experience, and then you go for another jump and another jump, and everything kind of mutually reinforces things. So, you know, I've experienced mental health kind of all of my adult life, and probably all of my life in my childhood. No information about that before the internet, nothing to kind of grab onto. All I thought was, you know, maybe I was just not as good at being a human as other people. Then as I kind of came to adulthood in the late 90s, still pre-internet, what I ran into was lots of anti-psychiatry stuff. After doing kind of psychology A level, and that seemed to make sense, the kind of revelatory possibility that actually, you know, I wasn't inherently broken, maybe society was inherently broken. And that kind of shaped my experience and my thoughts about myself. Still doesn't stop me like trying to do a university degree and failing to complete a first year twice and then falling out into poverty and all of those kind of things. And then I started to kind of consume different ideas and thoughts about mental ill health and distress and trauma. But the point is that the things that speak to you are the things that connect to what you already know, the things that have a kind of context and a ground. And that in some ways, this is why the idea of survivor history as a complicated and complex thing is really important, because finding ways of communicating the complexity, the exclusions, the discriminations, the things that do and don't get told, create those kind of hooks, those keys that future knowledge can kind of fit into. So if you kind of have a broad sense that actually this group of people get a really raw deal, then when you come across something that is, builds upon that, it has something to key to. So the idea that every story about mental health, distress, and trauma has to be a revelation, and needs to be written as if no one has ever had thoughts, written or broadcast or spoken about as if no one has ever had thoughts or experiences about this before, is a bit of a weird one, but it is where things like Time to Change and stuff started.
Thanks so much, Mark. Naomi, did you want to come in on that as well? Oh, and before you do, actually, can I just read another comment from the chat, which I think is relevant, which I've just lost. Yep, so it's that point about consuming stories, and someone has put, I also love catharsis and redemption in stories. I don't think it's wrong to look for hope, but you're right that we're often not taught how to respond to harder or more challenging emotions or stories.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, like who are the stories for? Because fundamentally that is the reason for a lot of the anti-stigma campaigns, and I think they are almost to make that it's like the face of mental health and to make things seem more sort of palatable and within reach and connect. And there is that it's really strong sense of trying to connect, but it's like connect with what? Because I agree that as humans, I think we want a narrative, we want stuff to make sense, and I think so one of the services that my organisation runs is a helpline, and one of the things that we spend a lot of time training people who go on it is about not speculating what might be going on for someone, and that not letting your drive for a narrative and a need to make sense of what's being said overtake the support element of the conversation that's being offered, and that actually asking lots of questions and trying to work out what's going on and thinking this doesn't make sense to me, you have to just sit with that. But I don't think that is a particularly, I know that's something I've had to learn in this type of work, and it's not a particularly mainstream sort of thing that people actively try to do. We do really want to make it make sense and make it wrap up really nicely, and we're looking for that. I think something that tried to challenge that was so there's an organisation called the Scottish Recovery Network, and when I first started working in this area, sort of 2005 onwards, they had published a set of narratives about recovery, but I think they were very clear that did not mean this nice neat wrapping up with a bow, this happened and now I'm fine. It was more actually some really devastating things happened to people. It wasn't a kind of I had this one episode and now I'm on the right medication and my family are really supportive. It was like, I lost everything, and now I've learned to a degree to manage this within this framework or network. And I think they'd probably be seen as less so now, but I felt like those stories it was quite a groundbreaking project, because that spoke to certainly my experience and a lot of people I knew, that this wasn't a nice, neat, linear thing. It hadn't been a one-off. It was becoming increasingly obvious this is a lifelong thing that I have to deal with, and how do I live my life, I guess, around that or with that, in spite of that. And so I think there was something about those narratives that were really powerful and spoke to me at that point in my life. But I think it's it's really, like you said, if there's no hope, then it is a bit, it's quite demoralizing. I remember working with somebody who we did an advocacy project specifically for people about people's experience of psychosis, and there was some stat, it was something like that people's employment rate, like the employment rates of people experiencing psychosis went down dramatically once they got into psychiatric services. And there was general, and I came across a lot of people who'd just been told, this, you have a chronic illness and you'll never work again. So I think there's that. So, you know, there needs to be space for that hope, and that actually I have been that person and actually things have changed for me. But also it's about, I think what I'm grasping for now are things that are realistic, you know, and that actually chime with my own experience, that a lot of the time I'm functional, but I can be very not functional, and then everything really does fall apart. But it doesn't actually take away from the functional bits of my life. And I think there are far fewer stories like that, and I think that they're very important to have them out there. I think it's a really difficult one, because I think there is a sense of, especially when people get together collectively, there's a sense of wanting to share an experience, and sometimes that is the really difficult, horrible experiences. And then how do you know, take that forward? And like I said, my first job in this field was, I worked in collective advocacy, and I did a project for people who'd been given a personality disorder diagnosis, and then subsequently went on to do a project for people who'd experienced psychosis. And the purpose of that was, it was not to have a specific narrative or a story. It was really literally just to get people's experiences down on paper, and to have that sense of collectiveness. And that, you know, and what came out of it was, you sort of experience-led training and resources, and made a little film and things like that. But there was something very powerful about people saying, oh yeah, that happened to me too. And so I think that there's something about stories for the benefit of others in collective spaces is a really significant thing. And I think that's maybe where some of the anti-stigma campaigns, it kind of misses the mark, because it puts those stories out there, but they're sort of like, this is the story that we ought to all be telling as society, but there's no opportunity for discussion. And I think stories where there's an opportunity for discussion and bouncing off each other, that's when they perhaps are their most powerful, where they're in a discursive space, and people are generous enough to put their story out there and let other people take what they need to from it.
Naomi, I'm just reading something from the chat for you, which is someone saying, you are making so much sense. Thank you. I'm also going to read another comment, which I think picks up on some of what you touched on around some of the limitations of narrative. So much about lived experience, mental health and distress is not linear, predictable, 2D, flat, etc. I think simply by recording our histories without a more interpretative process, we lose some of the essence of our stories. We lose the personhood when we try to record ourselves in a way that people without our experiences want things reported. Psychiatry and understandings around mental distress have been dictated by colonialism, and I believe that in order to disrupt the narrative perpetuated by this dictation, we have to take a radically different approach. Mark, so I think you were going to come in and respond to Naomi.
Yeah. I think the idea of kind of decolonizing kind of narrative is really, really important, because I was just scribbling away on my notepad about how sometimes histories are correctives. They are kind of adding a series of strands or parallel paths to an already established story. I think what's interesting to me is when we talk about survivor history, we end up in some ways talking about survivors' history rather than the history of being a survivor. So kind of what's interesting for me is the question, the history of what it means to be a person who experiences very particular forms of mental ill health and discrimination in a society over time. So it's kind of, I think political histories of mental ill health and distress and trauma are really, really important. And in some ways, the kind of interpretive aspect is finding ways of linking our own and our collective stories to kind of the broader historical series of events. So this is one of the things that in some ways frustrates me, that there isn't a very easy to read, accessible, purchasable in WH Smith's at the railway station history of what it means to experience mental ill health in the UK from the foundation of the NHS to now. There just isn't. There are things that really influence people's mental health. Some of them are legislative, some of those are economic, some of those are social, cultural, etc. We don't just travel in our own mental health in a impervious, time-proof bubble through life, and we're not isolated from broader things. So I think there's a really interesting question for me about where the discussion of those of us who experience mental ill health, distress and trauma are in other histories, not just survivor history, but in the broad history of everything. Because when we get a history of our own, or if we already have a history of our own, I presume that's only a tool to argue for the space of a place in other people's history, and I think that's that is in a lot of ways linked to a whole variety of different liberation struggles in one way, shape or form.
I love that, Mark, the interconnected nature of that. We have a couple, I think, of questions. I am going to be cheeky and ask you one of my own first because I can, and I'm going to do that by picking up one of the comments, which I've been thinking about as well. So someone has put, I'm hearing something about history and stories as something that we draw upon in the present, and something that if we don't have access to, we suffer from and feel the loss. And throughout this conversation we've been having very early on a Tuesday morning, I felt very strongly the theme of loss. And I just wondered if you wanted to kind of like expand on that, like, what is the place of absence and loss, collective individual loss, within this context, within this conversation? Are we paying enough attention to it?
I think that's a really important and powerful question. And I think it was just making me think, I remember I once went to a sort of a workshop run by crews who do bereavement counselling, and they were talking about how actually understanding loss is something that we experience right through our lives with lots of different things. And they were talking more about kind of objects and also things like relationships. But I think there is something about that when we focus on the sort of redemption and or focus on the sort of disaster, then there's less space for actually what's not happened. I think Mark was talking about, the sort of that gap of like not talking about, there are things that are sort of fit into gaps that we don't discuss. And I think there is that sense of loss, of looking back at what might have been for people had systems been different and spaces been different, and looking at thinking about, I think when Mark was talking before, I was thinking about sort of civil rights movements in general, that there is a space, I feel like sort of there's a lot of stuff around sort of mad pride, mad studies, but it's not quite having, it doesn't quite seem to have held the same space as other sort of civil rights activism. And there is almost that sense of why not, and what is even less palatable about this than about rights in other areas. And I think on a very personal level, there is this sense of loss in like times when I've been really unwell, that I've lost time with my family, I've lost time with my child, I've lost time in my own life to do things. And there is, in some ways, when you're telling a story, there's got to always be stuff happening and you don't necessarily represent the gaps very well, if that makes sense. So we talk about this happened and this happened and this happened. And I mean, this brings me back to my kind of example around helpline work, where we are very much focused on people's emotional experiences. And I know whenever I go out and do training, and people are always saying to you, what should I do? What should I do? And I'm saying sometimes not doing anything is doing something. And actually we are in a really fast-paced world. Everything's digital. It's all like, oh, you're having a problem with this, have an app for that. And actually human connection, witnessing of people's experiences and acknowledging loss and gaps and things that might have been are quite powerful things to offer people. And I think you're right that in sort of writing of histories and of witnessing people's experiences, maybe we need to think carefully about making space for that space of loss, which is a universal experience. But again, often it's okay to talk about it in terms of if somebody's died or a relationship has ended, but actually the grief of, you know, only finding in your 40s and 50s people who've had similar experiences to you, and what you've lost by not coming across that 30 years earlier, or people choosing or not in a position to, I don't know, not that everyone wants to have children, but if you want to have children and that doesn't happen because of your mental health, that kind of thing, that those are really significant losses that are not societally acceptable to talk about. And if we're already talking about telling stories that are perhaps not seen as palatable, it's like, where do you make the space for, as well as the things that happened, the things that didn't happen?
Thank you. Did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, kind of continuing that thought. Dead people don't get to share their stories, and the versions of ourselves that might have been, had we not been limited by the society that we live in, don't get to look back on our troubles and difficulties and tell that story in a nice way, because we don't get to. People like us die 20 years younger, and more likely in poverty, and more likely without, close family relationships. So in some ways, when we're talking about survivor histories, we're talking about the loss of survivor futures sometimes as well. I think that's why it's such an emotional and challenging thing to do, because there's nothing more painful than someone telling your story wrongly. There's nothing more painful than someone telling your story badly, or telling your story for you when you feel you could have told it yourself. So I think ultimately the challenge is, we're not often telling an overall history, speaking about history that is comfortable and nice. Some people's histories are. Some people have a great time and great luck. Good luck to them, and through individual perseverance and all manner of things turn out all right. But the history, if there is a movement, it's a history of the people for whom it didn't turn out all right. The people who are dead and injured, who are just like left at the side of the highway of whatever progress has happened in other areas in society. And I find that, I find that reality very, 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 very humbling and troubling, and it's something that very much sticks with me.
Thank you, Mark. And we've got a comment in the chat. Loss is definitely something that is exclusive to the loss of life, rather than loss which incorporates a multitude of things. My partner unfortunately lived through an incredibly traumatic childhood, but there isn't a space for them to grieve what they could or should have had, which I think reflects both your points. I am going to pick up on a question stroke comment, if you would like to respond to it from one of our panelists, if that's okay, because we've got about 10 minutes left before the end of the session. So someone has said, people are much more than their stories. Great things can come out of lived experience. when you reduce people to a story, I think you are not showing enough respect for their lived experience. We need to be more ambitious for our people. Do either of you want to respond to that?
Sorry, I managed to mute and unmute and remute myself instantaneously. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that stories can be very powerful, but they can be, to an extent, in a lot of ways that we've discussed, quite reductive, and that somebody is only their story. And I think, to me, that sort of really reflects like some of the difficulty and frustration that people find around sort of clinical and medical notes, that they reflect one person's subjective view of you in one meeting based on what you've told them, and actually that is not the sum of who you are, but it follows you through lots of different settings as the sum of who you are. You know, the one thing I'm most cross about is that they said my brother is older than me, and I am definitely the oldest. But you know, I think there's something about that if you're focusing just on stories rather than the broader context and what that sharing, and I think, to me, it's not so much about people's stories and having a narrative to fit on a person as much as it is about sharing stories and what we can collectively do with that collective knowledge and experience. And I think that's really true, that is it Margaret Mead quote about never sort of underestimate what a small group of people can do if they put their minds to it. I know that's not the exact quote, but I think there's something about that there's something about the sharing and the connecting and then the acting together that is really powerful. And so it's not the story, and the story in isolation is potentially quite reductive and a sort of, again, like we said before, it can get used for other people's purposes to illustrate like someone's view. I remember like actually my friend who I met in the BPD support group, who used to be a social worker, and he said that once he was in a meeting where everyone said, oh, you know, so this person's got schizophrenia diagnosis, and what's, you know, let's look back in his notes and sort of review that. And the doctor went, well, he looks like a schizophrenic. And my friend was like, oh, what now? And I think there is that need in bigger systems to put people in boxes and not be curious and not ask questions, because that actually makes life more difficult. It takes longer. The number of times I've sat in sort of research and policy meetings where people are going, oh, but what do people from the, you know, BME community think of this? And I'm like, one, that's not a thing. And two, you'll need to physically go out and ask people. You cannot sit here in a room in a university and expect to miraculously get that information. But the time and effort that people need to put into that, it's just is not there, or people aren't willing to put it in, because it is a lot easier to go, oh, well, this is what we've got on paper. And so I think actually it's really important to think about stories in a context and in a collective context, and how everybody can use that bit of the jigsaw to work to look at things together and support each other to see the shifts and changes that they want to see, rather than kind of get stuck in actually the story is the thing, because it's not, it's sort of part of something much bigger.
I love that, this idea of the story being the beginning or a beginning rather than an end into itself. And I am just reading a comment from the chat, which is, that's why we need as many stories as possible to show that people really don't fit into these weird, reductive boxes. The more stories there are about the lived experience of schizophrenia, for example, the clearer the demonstration that we aren't all the same. Okay, we've got about 7 minutes left, so I'm just going to maybe ask you one final question, which is, I mean, what next for you? What would you like to see here? Yeah, I'm going to keep it super open and let you answer however you want. Is it the W.H. Smith book, Mark? Is that what you would like to see, amongst other things?
Oh, yeah, obviously W.H. Smith is vastly important, and no, I think we're all trapped in someone else's narrative all of the time. That's what being human is. Other humans have ideas about us, and we have ideas about other humans, and we're always trapped in a series of overlapping versions and understandings of what we are. I think for me, what I'd like to see next is the possibility of a form of liberation through survivor history, a way to escape into different ways of understanding the narratives that are assigned to us, the stories that are assigned to us from outside, as a way of kind of better understanding ourselves, but also more focus on our place in society. I wrote an obituary of Peter Campbell earlier this year for The Guardian. And one of the things that he said way back in like 1983 really stuck in my head, which was, you know, if there's kind of one reason why I'm doing this, it's to do with the wasted human potential. The fact that, you know, people are born and experience mental ill health or distress or trauma, and then the contribution that they could have made or we could have made to life and society never gets to happen. So I think instead of telling a story, creating histories of mental ill health for other people, I think what I'd like to see is histories of mental ill health that have utility, your mental ill health, distress, trauma, however you understand it, that have utility for us as individuals and as a movement, which you may or may not get in WH Smith. I don't know, I've not been for ages.
So I think mine is similar to Mark, but maybe slightly tangential. So I have a sort of retirement ambition, and I'm 42 now, so I've got probably like, what, with the current government, like 60 years to go before I can retire. So so my goal is to embed, like, and obviously this is coming from the perspective of working in a self-harm specific organization, but to actually sort of to embed lived experience training around self-harm into all healthcare, undergraduate healthcare profession training. I'm sure I probably will manage it, but I can try, I can dream. My daughter's school is all about aspiration, so I'm like holding on to that. But I think it was what Mark was saying, it's about the utility, it's about people's experiences being in places where they can be useful to those of us, you know, who are, you know, part of the sort of survivor movement or have experienced mental health difficulties. But I think there's also something about, if we are stuck with the system that we have, which ideally we would not be, how do you tackle that system? Because I don't know about other people, but on a personal level, the biggest stigma and discrimination I have experienced and the biggest losses I've experienced have been in relation to attempting to seek support within the current system. And that is where I feel that and I think when you go in and you actually talk to people, they're like, oh yeah, but I think there's something about being reeled in as the tokenistic like person to tell their story versus being able to tell things on a much more collective level and say that, you know, loads of people are saying this and this is a much broader experience. It's not like this one person. I think there is utility to that. I'm not, I guess part of me wants to go, this would change everything, and part of me thinks this would change nothing. So it is quite a big ask, but I think it's about enforcing space for our experiences in the current systems in a way that is currently not allowed to be there, that it's not nice and neat, it's not what people want to hear, but it is reality. And that is ultimately what people want support and care for, is actually their reality, not somebody else's imposed view. And again, it's almost like it's almost like competing stories, isn't it? That there's your actual story and there's what people think your story ought to be, and how do we make as much space as possible in as potentially a disruptive a way as possible for the stories that are the real stories.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined in on the chat. It's been really active. That just felt like a really, really generous discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's joined us as well. We will try to publish the recording as soon as we can in case you want to rewatch or share this discussion. When you leave, a quick poll should pop up when you exit, so please take a minute to give us your feedback, and we'll hopefully see you later during the day as we have a number of panels on. But yeah, just once again, thank you to our BSL interpreters, and thank you to Mark and Naomi for such a wonderful discussion. And I'm seeing lots of thank yous in the chat as well.